Hey everyone, I'm going to go through our first two macromolecules with you, the carbohydrates and the lipids. And I like to put these two together in our notes because they have similar structures and they also have similar functionalities. So if we can kind of, decipher between the two, right away we'll be in good shape. So we've got our carbohydrates to start. Hopefully, we can already think of some like common carbohydrates that you might take in on a regular basis. So you have some good examples. And hopefully, we're familiar with the fact that they do provide us with a good source of energy. But I want to go through some of the chemistry behind that and how we know we have a carbohydrate versus a lipid. So, um, the general chemical formula is going to look like this, right? So there will be double the hydrogen atoms, then carbon and oxygen in there. So we're just representing the number there and doubling that with hydrogen. Um, so as I talked about in the previous lesson, monomers are building blocks for our polymers or our big macromolecules. So the monomer or the building block to carbohydrates are known as simple sugars, aka monosaccharides. So one sugar for monosaccharide. There's a couple examples of them listed there, and you can see their ratios for their chemical formulas as well. So it goes to 1 to 2 to 1 ratio of carbon to hydrogen to oxygen for each of these. So that's one big indicator that we have a carbohydrate, those ratios. Okay, so monosaccharides are the simple sugars or the building blocks for carbohydrates. Then the polymers or the complex carbs, their terms are disaccharides and polysaccharides. And so if you break down the word disaccharide, di is referring to two, and then polysaccharide is many, so then that's like three or more of our monosaccharides up here. And then there's some examples which we'll get into in our next unit when we start to talk about cells and things like that. But hopefully these are not too foreign with you, at least like our glucose one is super common. So giving you the visual of that. So our monosaccharides are going to be, right, a single sugar. So we can see that our carbs in general are going to take the ring shape, right? We can see that over here. Our carbon backbone is in a ring shape. Like we talked about in our carbon notes. And then, so we see a disaccharide here. Why? Because we have two of them, and we have a monosaccharide down here, or a polysaccharide down here, or our complex carb because it has three or more ring structures to them. So another thing, hopefully you were looking at this, it will have that 1 to 2 to 1 ratio of carbon to hydrogen to oxygen. That's how you know for sure you have yourself a carbohydrate. Another thing is take a look at these molecules that are kind of attached to the end. What are they? Why, those are O's and Ho's. They are the hydroxyls. So that is a common functional group that you find in our carbohydrates. So you might also see a carbonyl, but that also starts with carb. So you might see that in there, but you for sure will see these hydroxyls. All right. Talking about our polysaccharides, what are their purposes or what are their functions and where can we find them? So, as we should know already, carbs are a great source of energy. And then these different polysaccharides that I have a list here are all going to be different versions of energy and structural components for our plants, for our animals, for our fungi, etc., and bacteria. And we'll eventually get to know these, like I said, in our cells unit, which is coming up next. Starch and glycogen, they look very similar to each other. In fact, they look like mirror images of each other. Um, they're both energy storage, but one's specifically for plants, and then which is starch, and then the glycogen is used for animals and some fungi as well. Another polysaccharide is known as cellulose, and that is specifically found in the structural support of our plant cells. So that's what allows our plants to grow up and grow strong. Chitin is another form of a polysaccharide that looks like the other few, but this is going to be a structural component for the exoskeletons of a variety of our hard shell insects, we'll say, our arthropods, okay? And like I mentioned above, the difference between starch and glycogen is which animal they are. The difference between starch and cellulose, again, they're both storing energy. The rings look similar, but there are some slight differences in there. And for us, hopefully you are aware of this, we can digest starch, but we can't digest cellulose. So there are some different components there. Here's the visual of this. Again, because we're talking carbs, they're all in their lovely ring structure and kind of in this um, linear format as it goes across, right? Sorry. Um, so you can see some of the structural differences between cellulose and starch, like I just referenced. So up here are groups that are attached. Okay, those are just slightly different, but they have very similar structural um, components to them. Glycogen is for animals, and starch is for our plants. My goodness. Anyway, chitin is for our exoskeletons. And again, that one is um, quite a bit different in our structural components and therefore their overall functions, because it's going to be a little more for movement and support. All right. Our next group of macromolecules are the lipids. Again, you're going to see the same atoms as you did see in carbohydrates. So there will be carbon, there will be hydrogen, and there will be oxygen. But the ratios are not as simplistic as carbohydrates. So you're not going to see that same 1 to 2 to 1 ratio. So that will be another giveaway. These lipids, you can see, think of several examples: waxes, oils, fats, steroids. And then hopefully that reminds us of one of our terms we've been learning about, how they are hydrophobic because they are nonpolar. And then you can think of several different functions that they might have. So they're going to protect you, they'll insulate you, and they're also a great source of energy. It's just less efficient for us to utilize the lipids. So, again, twice as many calories per gram, but less efficient. So, their monomers, what are their building blocks? There will be a glycerol and there will be fatty acid chains that hang off of them. So, the fatty acid chains are what they sound like. So, we know we have saturated and unsaturated fats. You can identify those by looking at what happens to their carbon backbone and their carbon chain. So there will be just in saturated fats, there's just going to be like single bonded carbons. There's no double bond or kink in it. And these ones are dangerous because there is no kink, which I'll give you the visual of it. They can pack really closely together and almost like solidify. So they're linked to heart disease and issues with arteries coming from our variety of, what do I want to say, meat sources. We can go with that. And then our unsaturated fatty acids are going to be the ones that have a double bond in them or they have a kink to them, which allows for some flexibility and I guess if you want to say they're the better fatty acids than the saturated ones. We'll go with that. So what do they look like? Here we go. Saturated. Here's our linear carbon backbone as it goes along here. Again, they can all line up next to each other and almost kind of solidify, which is dangerous, versus the kinked unsaturated fat over here because of the double bond that we see. And then, so if you look at the end, we've got COOH. So we've got our carboxyl groups attached. That's one of our functional groups that you're going to see in lipids. An example of a lipid that is super, super important to remember is the phospholipids. They make up the cell membranes, the plasma membranes. There's a phospholipid bilayer that makes up the cell membrane, and the heads on that phospholipid bilayer are going to be hydrophilic, so they will interact and love the water. So they have a phosphate group attached to it. And then the tails that hang off of them are two fatty acid chains, and those are hydrophobic, right? Because our fats are hydrophobic and they will stick away from the water. Hence my little joke down here to kind of get you that idea of the hydrophilic heads up here and then the water gun and how the tails are afraid of that. And then they create this little back-to-back layer. So the inside has minimal water because that's where the tails hang out. And then on the outside, they're exposed to more of that water. And then another example of our lipids are steroids. Lots of people link steroids to proteins. That's a common misconception. Excuse me. So those will be represented by rings. And there's some examples of steroids. And I wanted to give you there's no good place to put me, structural component up here. Structural components for our phospholipids. They have, again, their phosphates are up here, so you can see the PO4 group, okay? We've got carbonyls, you can see that over here, our CH2s. So we can see our fatty acid tails are linked in there, but there's the phosphate piece that is key for the polar hydrophilic head that goes on our phospholipid bilayer. This is just generally kind of like the 3D model of it, okay? And again, this is a look at it. So the head has a phosphate and is polar. The tails are hydrophobic or non-polar there. And we can see the bilayer all linked together. So that covers our phospholipids, and I'll see you another day to cover our last two categories of proteins and nucleic acids.